Today's number 15 most urgent vulnerability on the Daily Ranked CVE Brief is CVE 2026-55255 in Langflow. And even though it is not a perfect 10, it earns attention because it combines three things defenders should never ignore: a high CVSS score, a very high EPSS percentile, and placement on CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. Langflow is a tool for building and deploying AI-powered agents and workflows. That means the affected asset is not just another web app. It may sit near prompts, agents, integrations, internal workflows, and automation logic that organizations increasingly rely on. The issue is an authorization flaw. An authenticated attacker can execute a flow belonging to another user by referencing that victim's flow ID at the affected API endpoint. This episode is defense only. No payloads, no proof of concept walkthrough, no exploit recipe. The goal is simple: understand the exposure, identify whether your Langflow deployment is in range, and decide what to patch first based on real exploitation signal. CVE 2026-55555 affects Langflow. The official NVD description says that prior to version 1.9.1, an insecure direct object reference vulnerability in the /API/v1/responses endpoint allows an authenticated attacker to execute any flow belonging to another user by specifying the victim's flow ID in the request. The weakness is mapped to CVE-639. In plain English, that means the application is trusting a user-controlled identifier too much. A flow ID points to a specific object inside the application. The security question is not just, does this flow ID exist? The security question is this logged-in user allowed to act on this specific flow? In a properly enforced authorization model, every sensitive object access is checked against the current user's rights. In an IDOR, that object-level authorization check is missing, incomplete, or bypassable. Here the dangerous object is a Langflow flow, and the action described is execution. Verdict: this is a high-severity access control failure where authentication is required, but strong object ownership is not reliably enforced. The CVSS score is 8.4, rated high, with a network attack vector. The two metrics that matter most are low privileges required and no user interaction. In other words, the attacker does not need to trick the victim into clicking something. They need an authenticated position in the application. That can include a normal low-privileged account, depending on how the deployment is configured. The other key part is impact. Confidentiality and integrity are both rated high. That reflects the fact that executing another user's flow can expose or alter outcomes tied to that flow's behavior, logic, data handling, or connected workflow context. The vector also has high attack complexity, which means exploitation is not scored as the simplest case. But high complexity does not cancel out the risk, especially when CISA says the vulnerability is known to be exploited. The most important signal here is not just the 8.4, it is CISA KEV status. Being listed in the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog means defenders should treat this as an active risk vulnerability, not a theoretical bug waiting for a future research paper. The EPS percentile provided for this CVE is 0.97964, which places it very high compared with other vulnerabilities for predicted exploitation activity. Those two signals together are why it appears on today's ranked list. The real-world concern is cross-user execution. If a Langflow instance hosts multiple users, teams, projects, or tenants, the boundary between one user's flow and another user's flow matters. AI workflows can represent business processes, data transformations, agent behavior, or connections into other services. Even without assuming any specific integration, unauthorized execution can undermine trust in who initiated a workflow and whether the result was legitimate. Conceptually, the path is straightforward, but the defensive takeaway is more important than the mechanics. The attacker starts from inside the application as an authenticated user. They interact with the affected responses API area, where requests are associated with flow identifiers. The flaw described by NVD is that specifying a victim's flow ID can allow execution of a flow that belongs to someone else. That is the classic IDOR pattern. The attacker does not need administrator privileges if the application fails to verify object ownership at the moment of access. For defenders, the reachability question is, who can authenticate to Langflow, and what can those accounts see or trigger? If Langflow is exposed broadly, if user registration is permissive, if many contractors or service accounts have access, or if multiple teams share one deployment, the blast radius increases. If access is tightly limited, monitored, and segmented, the risk is reduced, but it still needs patching because the vulnerable authorization logic is in the application layer. Start with inventory. Find every Langflow deployment your organization runs, including development, staging, lab, and internal automation environments. Do not assume only internet-facing instances matter. This vulnerability requires authentication, so internal multi-user systems can still be exposed. The official NVD description states that Langflow prior to 1.9.1 is affected, and that the vulnerability is fixed in 1.9.1. Use that as your initial triage point, then confirm exact applicability against the vendor security advisory for your installation method and deployment model. Next, identify whether the /API/v1/responses endpoint is reachable by authenticated users in your environment. Review how accounts are created, who has access, and whether the same Langflow instance is shared across users or teams. If you operate Langflow as a single-user local tool, the exposure profile is different from a shared service, but patching remains the cleanest answer. The primary remediation is to update Langflow to the fixed version identified by the advisory. NVD states that this vulnerability is fixed in 1.9.1. Prioritize shared, production, externally reachable, or broadly accessible Langflow instances first. While patching is underway, reduce unnecessary access. Limit who can authenticate, remove stale accounts, rotate credentials where appropriate, and make sure administrative access is not used for routine workflow activity. If Langflow sits behind a reverse proxy, identity provider, VPN, or other access layer, verify those controls are actually enforced for the affected application. Also review flow ownership. Look for flows that are sensitive, connected to important business processes, or owned by privileged users. After patching, test authorization behavior from a defensive standpoint. A normal user should not be able to execute another user's flow unless the product explicitly supports that sharing model and the user is authorized. Finally, preserve relevant logs before they rotate, because KEV status makes retrospective review worthwhile. For detection, focus on mismatches between the authenticated user and the flow owner. If your application logs, API gateway logs, or audit trails record user identity, flow identifiers, and execution events, review whether a user executed flows they do not own or should not access. Normal behavior should show a clear relationship between the authenticated principal and the flow being run, owner, authorized collaborator, or expected service account. Suspicious behavior includes repeated attempts against different flow IDs, executions of high-value flows by low-privileged accounts, activity from accounts that normally do not run workflows, or spikes in requests to the responses endpoint. Also look for timing anomalies, such as workflow execution outside normal business hours, and source anomalies, such as new IP addresses or unexpected network locations for a known user. After patching, monitor for denied authorization attempts or errors around the same endpoint. Those can indicate either testing, broken integrations, or continued probing. To recap, CVE 2026-55255 is a Langflow IDOR, tracked as CVE-639, affecting the responses API behavior described by NVD. The issue can allow an authenticated attacker to execute another user's flow by specifying that victim's flow ID. It is scored 8.4 high, with the most important practical factors being low privileges required, no user interaction, and high confidentiality and integrity impact. The reason it made today's Daily Ranked CVE Brief at number 15 is the exploitation signal. It is on CVE, and it has a very high EPSS percentile. Patch to the fixed Langflow release identified by the advisory. Reduce unnecessary authenticated access, and review logs for cross-user flow execution. If this format helps your team decide what to patch first, subscribe to the Daily Ranked CVE Brief. We rank by real exploitation signal, CVE, first EPSS, and CVSS every day. The full ranked report is linked in the description.